turns or not, so please be gentle. I'm still a student. So let's go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 2. Intertextuality, as it regards the New Testament author's employment of Old Testament passages, has been a source of a lot of consternation in biblical studies. Authors pore over the issues and fail to reach a consensus on just what the apostles were doing with Old Testament texts. One of the most problematic passages in intertextuality studies is Matthew 2:19 through 23, because it lacks a clear Old Testament reference. If Matthew is using the formula for a prophetic purpose, then how can an unknown prophecy be fulfilled, and where is the text cited to be found? But when the original reader is kept in mind, we see that Matthew was creating a hermeneutic of suspicion, causing the reader to ask these exact same questions and creating a deliberate rhetorical effect. This paper is going to argue that the unknown referent of Matthew 2:19 through 23 can be found in the referent of the next identical citation. This has a deliberate rhetorical effect by resolving the suspense created by the allusion citation in Matthew 2:23 and highlights the important narrative material between these two passages as a type of inclusiveness. This paper is going to seek to determine how Matthew artistically arranged and derived the significance of the Old Testament passage for his contemporary readership in line with Christ. It will proceed by way of a short explanation of methodology and relevant exegesis of the prom passage with a review of previously proposed solutions. Then the paper is going to examine the next successive instance of the quotation formula to show how it best explains the unclear reference of the preceding introductory formula. This paper will conclude by offering an evaluation on the rhetorical effect of Matthew's creating suspense to build interest among his readers. So where's some contextual consideration coming to this? I've argued elsewhere in agreement with Turner that the Gospel of Matthew is probably written for a didactic purpose based around the 5 major discourses. However, within the infancy narrative, there does seem to be a deliberate apologetic effort to explain Jesus' Nazarite providence. So the goal of this is to examine what I think is a forward-pointing instance of the term Pleroo. So the term Pleroo is often lost as to fulfill or to make full, to fill full. There are other glosses that are available, but these linguistic options have served to intensify the debate. Does the employment indicate a prophecy, a typological foreshadowing, or simply an allusion? This problem is compounded by Matthew 2:19 through 23 not having an Old Testament passage that describes the Messiah being tied to Nazareth. And Matthew says clearly that he would be called a Nazarene. Popular sentiments among Jerusalem's intelligentsia would not have equated the Messiah with a Gentile-dominated area like Nazareth or Galilee, if John's testimony is trustworthy in John 7:52. So there does seem to be an apologetic purpose to Matthew's citation formula, but there's still no text with a clear record. The reader who's familiar with the Old Testament in Matthew's time may, just like contemporary readers, have been frustrated with Matthew's plagiarism, his seemingly mistaken reference. So as we look at Matthew 2:19 through 23, we know that it's part of the infancy narrative. But verse 19 is going to begin the falling action of the infancy narrative. The climax was found in the previous section, where the primary conflict was Herod seeking to eliminate a potential rival to the throne. Herod was zealous to protect his power at all costs. And the flight to Egypt presents a problem for the readers. They expected their Messiah to conduct his ministry inside of Israel. This passage that we're dealing with in 2:23 to 26 is going to reorient the readers by placing the Messiah back in his expected setting, following the resolution of the threat. And it should be considered a fallen action. Fallen actions and narratives serve to tie up loose ends of their stories, and this section of the infancy narrative is no different. It's going to do this by moving the Messiah back to Israel and revealing the death of Herod through an angelic announcement that prompts the family's return. Though this verse is Matthew's narration and not direct speech, it orients the reader to receive the material in the following verses that would otherwise seem unnatural. Discourse analysis has shown that it is natural to see a progression in sentence structure from old information to new information. Matthew begins his paragraph by engaging a previous reference, Herod, and then adding new information, Herod's death. Matthew then explains it through a temporal conjunction with a logical relationship. After Herod died, an angel appeared. And the narrative purpose for this new information won't be explained until the next verse. Verbal aspect studies also help us analyze these verses, as it shows the prominence being emphasized on Herod's death. It's a participle form foregrounding the present indicative of the angel's appearance. Herod's death is not as important to Matthew's argument as it is that the angel appeared. Herod's death being a participle and the angel's appearance being present indicative. In Matthew's birth narrative, only Joseph receives angelic revelation in contrast to Luke's infancy. Joseph's role in the Messianic kingdom is more prominent in Matthew's account. Matthew continues to follow a pattern where the Holy Family is giving imperatives to obey in light of new indicative facts which the angelic messengers reveal. Verse 20 begins an introductory exposition of the scene with the angel's direct speech. All notes that direct speech is particularly important for analyzing narrative in the Old Testament, and for the New Testament, it's still a useful grid. The angel begins with an imperative and then gives the indicative. He commands Joseph to go with a clear progression, go, arise, take, and is moving through with an argument that's going to be named. The foregrounded verb in the present imperative is to go. It's time for Joseph to leave Egypt and take his family with him. He's safe to do this because those who sought the life of the child are not dead. This similarity to Exodus 12:31, where Pharaoh commanded people, arise, go, you and your people, after a violent judgment, seems an appropriate allusion when viewed in conjunction with the Hosea reference in 2:11. Verse 21 is succinct with mainline and unemphasized verbal forms where Joseph does exactly what he has done throughout Matthew 2. He's obedient to the angel's commands. However, notice that this verse in 21 is nearly identical to Matthew 2:14, except for the description of movement. He arose, taking the child and his mother. As Joseph departed Israel, he did so under the cover of night. And this may be more than just a historical recounting, though not less, having an intentional narrative effect. Darkness in biblical literature will often denote sin or danger. The author set up the departure in 2:14 by explaining the portents of what's to follow. By contrast, there's no such bad omen in Matthew 2:21. The danger of a sinful ruler is now gone in Joseph's mind. They're departing in daylight, but the grammatical change that shows he went to Egypt is viewed as a completed action. When we get to the different form in 2:21, we see that he was in the process of going back to his homeland. By showing this uncompleted action, Matthew is highlighting that it's not going to end the way that Joseph thinks it's going to. As Joseph expects, he begins his move, but he won't settle down like he did in Egypt. He's going to end up somewhere different than he intended. Joseph's travel log is going to be modified from the original intention with a minor conflict that will be resolved before coming to the end of the scenario. Verse 22 begins with the contrastive conjunction, informing the reader of the change which is foreshadowed by the continuing action of the previous verse. Joseph heard that Archelaus was now king. The emphasis for verbal aspect studies is again on Archelaus' reign, causing the unhighlighted verbal form of Joseph's fearful response. This fear made Joseph hesitate to return to Judea. But then he was instructed, subjugated to the stronger verbal forms earlier in the verse, to move to the region of Galilee. This foregrounded verb is Archelaus' reign, and every action in the verse is hinging upon it. Verse 23 comes to our problem citation. It's the text under consideration. The connective chi notes that Joseph is still obeying the commands of God and the angels, and so he goes to dwell in a city called Nazareth. The name of the city is foreground. It's important for the entire narrative, it's fronted, and its presumed apologetic purpose is to explain Jesus' origins. Not only is the verb of naming foregrounded, a city called, but the phrase itself is fronted. A Nazarene he shall be. The Greek word order is commonly accepted as subject, verb, object, but this sense is object, subject, verb. The fronting of the direct object is emphatic in this quotation form. The grammatical construction presents no problems, emphasizing Matthew's apologetic concern to defend the Nazarene providence of Christ, which would need explaining. What is unexpected is the explanation he gave. Matthew employs a redundant quotative frame, which is a forward-pointing device in discourse analysis. He's drawing attention to what's coming out in the direct speech. He's not just throwing out a verse. He's slowing down the narrative with this redundant quotative frame, wanting you to focus on the words going to come out of his mouth. Now, if I'm going to quote somebody and I'm going to quote them wrong, I'm probably not going to draw attention to it. I guess a lot of people in trouble in Southern Baptist circles are. But here we see Matthew slowing it down with a redundant quotative frame, drawing attention to it, and you're like, where's this verse? The prophets don't say that. Imagine being a reader. So what does the reader have to do? Matthew's not there. He wrote it and sent it away. They got to listen to the guy reading it. And so we continue reading. This term pleroo, to fulfill, is going to have a range of meanings, and causality is inherent in the term. BDAC's fourth option has typically become a standard understanding of the term. To bring to a designed end, to fulfill a prophecy, an obligation, a promise. But lexical entries also notice the idea of fulfilling a destiny, which seems more appropriate because of the lack of clear reference in the immediate context. The lack of a clear reference is problematic. The explanation offered by Matthew makes little sense if there is no prophet who said that Moses would come from Nazareth. Matthew is clearly seeking to portray Jesus through the genealogy in 1:1-17 as Christ, as well as the subsequent revelation of Matthew in 1:20-23, where he calls him Emmanuel. How could Matthew claim that the word of the prophets were fulfilled concerning a Nazarite Messiah when there's no scriptural support to be found? Scholars have offered multiple solutions to this problem. Previously proposed solutions to the lack of Hebrew reference include Craig Blomberg. He's going to note three primary solutions in the commentary on the Old Testament use of the New. And the first one's going to be a wordplay between Nazarene and the Hebrew netzer for branch. Nazarene is understood as a derogatory slang term for someone from the insignificant little town Nazareth in Galilee. Or an allusion to Judges 13:7, creating a comparison between Jesus and Samson, since this verse also includes a promise that the woman will conceive and bear a son, similar to Matthew 1:21. Barnett offers a fourth option, where the wordplay between branch and Nazareth is due to the town being a Davidite clan village upon the resettlement of the area during the Hasmonean times. So these are the four main options among interpreters. So we're going to critique each one of them very briefly. So critique of the first option. It's generally accepted that throughout biblical times, Hebrew culture was oral. As such, the community was accustomed to hearing the scriptures read to them in synagogues and in their relationship with rabbis, of which Jesus was counted. Although assonance was a popular literary device among Jewish teachers and scriptural authors, the explicit nature of Matthew's scriptural citations would imply that he preferred clear reference for his scriptural assertions. This idea of a Davidic branch coming out of a stump is a biblical theme that's found in multiple texts. However, it fails to narrow the text to a specific record. The strength of that argument is that the Davidic branch theme was well known, assonance was a popular literary device, and the historical setting shows an expectation of a Davidic branch being raised up. If this interpretation cannot be bested, it is probably the one to be preferred. However, it fails to explain how Matthew could associate a town with Davidic expectations through a sonnet, when the Messiah's expected genesis was the town of Bethlehem. Though Matthew's apologetic penchant is evident, a sonnet for a fulfillment passage is difficult to reconcile. That would probably not be the best way to prove an apologetic point, through rhyme. A sonnet often serves a didactic purpose, but the employment of a scriptural citation formula for a theme instead of a direct citation seems uncharacteristic for Matthew's other uses of the rhyme. It is for this reason other options must be, and indeed have been, asserted. Representatives of this first option include John Nolan, Donald Hagner, Grant Osborne, although Osborne combines this with the second option. The second option. Blomberg asserts that this is the only place in the entire gospel where Matthew makes reference to prophets in the plural rather than a singular prophet as a source of an Old Testament reference. It suggests that he knows he is not quoting one text directly, but rather is summing up a theme found in several prophetic texts. This observation must be recognized. In fact, my conclusion is going to come out very similarly, but it's going to be just two prophetic texts. This provides no boundaries of which this theme should be contained, and that's led speculation building upon the cultural rejection associated with the Galilean territory, noted in both Matthew and John's Gospels. Other arguments allude to the despised nature of the Messiah from the Isaianic servant songs, implying linkage with the despised nature of the Nazarenes and Galileans living in Gentile communities. Adherents to this include Jared August, based on the arguments of R.T. France, Craig Blomberg, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison, Ulrich Luz, and D.A. Carson, who also allows the first option to have some influence on the wording. Critique of the third option. The third option is attractive because God did in fact use three famous Nazarites to deliver his people. Judges 13:7, with the account of Samson, is problematic for modern readers. However, Jewish readers and biblical authors had no problem counting Samson as a hero of the faith. Samuel, the second famous Nazarite, also delivered his people from foreign oppression and restored worship from a corrupt priesthood. The third Nazarite, John the Baptist, is perhaps the strongest link to Jesus being the Nazarite. Like Samson and Samuel, John the Baptist was being used to usher in God's kingdom, engaging in political struggles. All three Nazarite accounts revolve around barren women. Mary was young and of marriageable age with no hint of barrenness. However, through Cal Homer, we could explain this through the analogy of a more miraculous birth from lesser to greater. However, like the first option, we still fail to adequately explain why Jesus grew up in Nazareth. Jesus' life would have destroyed any allusion to a Nazarite mountain. His first miracle produced 120 gallons of wine. Jesus had a reputation as a wine bibber, and he seemingly had no intention of presenting himself as a Nazarite during his earthly life or in the future. Proponents of this view include Martin Mencken and David Turner. But this option must be rejected as unfeasible for more reasons than its failure to give a clear textual record. It doesn't seem anyone reading that text will see Jesus making that much wine as suggesting himself as a Nazarite. Critique of the fourth option. Though Martin's argument is creative and builds upon the assonance, which has proven popular, it's unnecessarily difficult. It doesn't explain the fact there is no direct evidence of a text, biblical or otherwise, from which Matthew would have quoted. There is no historical basis for Barnett's hypothesis that the village was Davidic. In fact, John 1:47 becomes problematic if the village was Davidic. Though he states that Jesus' family would have been among his loyal supporters after his death, Jesus enjoyed no such popularity during his life. The following Jesus did have during his earthly ministry can be explained other ways. For example, over 30 years, it would be expected that a sinless and therefore a morally good person would have made friends and given him a welcoming audience. Furthermore, Christ's closest disciples came from Galilee and could just as easily explain the area's prominence in the various Gospels and Acts. The ad hoc interpretation of Barnett is more easily explained by less ad hoc interpretation. With the options for interpreting the referent of the passage still unknown, the conclusion regarding final interpretation must await a further explanation from the Gospel of Matthew. I think anyone getting to Matthew 2 isn't happy with any of the options, and they have to continue reading, waiting for something more. As the narrative progresses, the next occurrence of Pleroo is going to be found in Matthew 4:12-17, which happens to provide a direct prophecy which places the Messiah in the location of Galilee. If Matthew clearly provides particular scriptural references for the other 9 of the 10 Pleroo passages preceded by Rethaim, as well as 9 of the 10 Gegraptai passages, and all 6 of the "you have heard it said" formula quotations, the weight of evidence seems to imply that there should be a particular referent for the 2 that remain. So let's look at Matthew 4:12-17 and see if this works. Verse 12 begins a new section with a transitional conjunction. Some unknown period has elapsed, so Jesus has now heard the news about John the Baptist. The reference is clear, since the only John mentioned is the Baptist in the baptismal scene. He'd been arrested, which will not be pertinent to Matthew's narrative until chapter 11. And for the time being, Matthew seems content to keep the emphasis on Jesus instead of explaining away John's arrest. The descendant, Jesus being introduced as the Christ, the descendant of Adam, Seth, Noah, Shem, Abraham, Judah, and David, will now serve as the paragon of blessing according to the appropriate Old Testament covenants and the rightful heir to the throne. In chapter 2, Christ had been announced as the proper king of the Jews. In chapter 3, he had been announced as the Son of God, and therefore he is rightly the center of the narrative. It's Christ's movements that are going to be of central concern in Matthew's narrative, and now Jesus returns to Galilee after his testing in the wilderness. Verse 13 describes Jesus' return to Galilee, centered in Nazareth, the town to which Joseph had returned in 2:22-23. However, Jesus again moves from his familial home to live in Capernaum by the sea, which is located in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. The announcement of the Christ living outside of his ancestral land allocated to Judah is peculiar, but it's immediately explained by the narrator. Verse 14 employs the resultant conjunction "him," showing that Christ's new home of record was not a mere happenstance, but was necessitated by what was spoken of the prophet Isaiah. There's a redundant quotative frame, again slowing down the narrative, drawing attention to the following verbs of speech. The quotation is a composite quote of Isaiah 9:1-2 and 42:7. The form of Isaiah 9 is thoroughly Septuagint, but the form of 42:7 is not clear enough to distinguish. Its immediate connection to another Septuagint form, however, suggests that this might be Septuagint dependent as well. These texts, however, should be examined in their Old Testament context. The apologetic nature of Matthew's argument for a Galilean home of record for the Messiah can be now firmly established through the Old Testament usage to persuade reasonable detractors. Isaiah 7-9 has been pivotal in Matthew's argument since the first chapter with the Emmanuel salvation. Isaiah 8, which immediately follows the quoted passage, discusses the birth of Maher-shalal-Hashbaz and the deliverance of Israel from Assyria and Damascus. Chapter 8, however, warns Isaiah not to fall prey to the political conspiracies plaguing his contemporaries, since Emmanuel will spare his people, since God is with him. This oracle of salvation in the first half of Isaiah 8 immediately precedes the warning to Isaiah, because the Holy Lord will be honored, even though he be a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel. It's important to note historically, the oracle of salvation that precedes in Isaiah 9, quoted in Matthew, is given when those tribes under consideration, Zebulun and Naphtali, are in exile under Assyrian domination. Isaiah tells them of a coming deliverance and an exodus through the birth of the Son in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. If Abijah is correct that biblical authors could allude to Old Testament texts in greater context, then the Emmanuel passage, the Davidic dependence of the genealogy, and the allusion to a ruler from Bethlehem would lend credence to a salvation oracle of Isaiah for Naphtali and Zebulun being fulfilled in Christ at the current moment of the narrative. The second part of the composite quotation comes from 42:7. This is also a salvation. Here, Isaiah prophesies that God will open the eyes and release from prison, which is a fitting exilic metaphor, those who sit in darkness. Isaiah 42:8-9 also is the fact that God will not share his glory with another. And yet Matthew says Christ shares the glory of God as his announced Son in Matthew 3:17. With the Old Testament context officially explained, and Christ's origins properly announced as fulfilling these salvation oracles to these lands in the prophecy of Isaiah, the narrative of Christ's earthly ministry can now begin. Verse 17 concludes the travelogue, ending chapter 4, with Jesus now being an independent adult, able to leave the house in care of his earthly Father, fully dependent on his heavenly Father. With his earthly maturity and spiritual maturity now firmly established, Jesus can branch out into his public ministry of preaching. His message is categorized as being one of repentance because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The at hand modifier is fronted for emphasis and often missed in English translation. Jesus' message is of an urgent nature, and that urgency would categorize further aspects of his earthly ministry, which would be pivotal in Matthew's narrative. So what is my proposed interpretation of Matthew 2:19 through 23 in light of 4:12-17? Now, many have found the wordplay to allude to the Isaiah passages cited above. They did so without proving this was the intention of Matthew. By recognizing the use of this unspecified reference role as looking forward to the next explicit citation form, their association with Isaiah 47 is strengthened, and the weaknesses of their arguments, which allow for multiple reference, is now removed, being contained to the two explicit references which are quoted. With the reader having been jarred from an unidentified textual reference in chapter 2, introduced emphatically with the redundant phrase, their interest would have been heightened, and asking questions of the reader or of themselves as they read privately, with no answer found in the context, listening to the narratives of chapter 3 and 4, as they see God the Father call Christ his Son, as they see him proved to be a son worthy of that title in the desert wilderness, and finally the tension is resolved at the end of this travel. After successfully proving his merit to serve as mediator, drawing strong allusions to Moses, Jesus is ministered to by angels before beginning his public ministry. The forerunner passes from the scene, and the Messiah, who is the new Adam, the new Noah, the promised son of Abraham and Davidic king, now takes center stage with all of his childhood and early rise to ascendancy being established on biblical grounds. With the prophecies of Isaiah cited clearly, the tension of the Messiah's location in Nazareth is resolved so the reader can rest. But by creating the unresolvable tension for 3 chapters, Matthew's drawn attention to the narrative actions which lay in between. These passages, Jesus is connected to God as his son. He's connected with the Davidic king. He's connected to Noah through a dove potentially. Connected to Moses through 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. Connected to Isaiah's deliverance prophesied in Isaiah 9:42. And through his location in Nazareth. Matthew shows that Jesus is fulfilling multiple messianic expectations before he ever begins his public ministry, while alleviating the common misconception that no prophet can come from down. The attraction of this solution is that it shows there is indeed a specific textual basis for the redundant quotation formula in chapter 2. The redundant quotation formula is not used haphazardly. It's designed to slow down a narrative, to draw attention. And in drawing attention to an apparent misquote, the author jeopardizes his credibility to an obviously well-read Jewish audience. However, by resolving the problem in the next subsequent employment of the same formula, Matthew creates this inclusio that draws the attention to the narrative laying between the two. And it is this aspect of the narrative which will be pivotal. While many may not have necessitated a virgin birth or a morally upright individual with the Messiah, as Second Temple Messianic movement seemed to show, they were now forced to reckon with the idea that Christ was a worthy Messianic candidate, approved by God preemptively before his testing under none other than the chief of demons, and that he preached the gospel in the areas prophesied in Isaiah 9 and 42. The weaknesses to this argument are few. In fact, I can only think of one. It's your guys' job to help me with that after this. I look forward to our discussion. And that's the fact that prophets is used in plural form. But I think that this can be explained through two separate citations within the same prophetic category. Christ was going to be the light to the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, and it was only through his light being shown in those areas that they would realize the salvation oracles that were given to them by the prophets. Such salvation oracles could include others like Ezekiel 37. In fact, Jerome seems to have come to a similar conclusion, but I see no need to extend this past those which were found in Isaiah 42 and 9. The author's choice of intentional ambiguity in 2 would have forced the reader to ponder what he was getting at until the particular reference that was explicit came in chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. So that concludes my paper. It looks like we got 15 minutes. Let's have that.
I like it. I'm curious, and I may have missed your reference to this, but the earlier passage about they will call his name Emmanuel. Okay.
Yep.
As far as I know, nobody ever called Jesus that.
Correct.
And then here in chapter 2, they'll call him Nazareth. Again, nobody ever called him that.
Yep.
That I'm aware of. Really? Where?
It was Matthew, in his trial, he's called Jesus the Nazarios.
Okay, same word?
Yep.
Okay.
Several references.
All right. But that in itself causes me to connect the Matthew 2 verse to the Emmanuel, which connects it to Isaiah. So I don't know what you think of that.
So I've actually written on Matthew 2, and I actually agree with Chow that when we're dealing with citations that it's going to a greater context.
Yeah.
And so I think that when he says you'll be called Emmanuel, it's actually not just the Isaiah 6 reference, but going through to the clear messianic prophecy a few chapters later, past the Mishra Halachashbah chapter. Yes.
Just quickly on that, the fact that they didn't use Emmanuel as a name didn't mean they didn't say God is with us.
No, of course not.
So, anyway. But I also really like this. I confess that I must have had an intimation of where you were going, or where your minds were in the same direction, because suddenly it grabbed me, it attracted me to that text as well. What this says then is that we need to go back and look at Matthew 2, where it says, and being warned in a dream, he went to the regions of Galilee and settled in Nazareth, thus fulfilling. See, we've got a verse number in there that prompts us to link the pleroo to the thing immediately preceding it. But it's not the thing that immediately preceded it. It was the regions of Galilee, and he settled in Nazareth. That's what fulfilled the prophecy. And that's syntactically quite appropriate. It's just that we were too wooden in our reading of it. And then on that basis, you could read the honey in some other way, perhaps. And that's the reason he was called the Nazarene, was they settled there. But that was not part of the prophecy. The prophecy was settling
Just
in Galilee.
region. I think that part of the whole.
But I'd encourage you to go back and look at the syntax there, because you've got to figure out what the thus fulfilled goes back to. And we've, I think, taken it wrong. not necessarily the thing that just happened, it's the whole phrase. I like it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
3 points. 2 are really nitpicky, just thoughts if you see publication. You might want to avoid the term limited suspicion.
Yeah, I know.
Because that may bring up
Yeah.
issues
I was
that are
trying to get
not
some
really
attention.
germane.
Yep. I was trying to get some attention there, not even gonna lie.
Second thing, you need to consider the possibility of polemic rather than pure apologetic in what Matthew's doing. But I'd say the biggest issue, and it's not a huge criticism because it's not a common position, but when you're building a disjunctive syllogism, as you appear to be doing, you need to include all of the major possibilities. And one possibility that it's not common is that this is morally preserved prophecy that's in reference rather than to, and I'm not saying that your work is bad here.
Yeah,
I'm just saying it's just something you need to note and say this is why this isn't the way to go.
Yes, sir.
Can you just tell me again in 1 or 2 sentences, what ties Nazarene to the citation in Matthew 4?
Part for all. Nazareth is an area in Galilee, so Jewish interpretation you go part for all. So it doesn't say anywhere that he'll be called a Nazarene, but it does say he will be a light in Galilee in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. And so part for whole, you can say that, just like we say the White House for Washington, D.C. We could go part for whole and people understand what we're talking about.
There's another way to look at that, and that Luke is, or that Matthew is here explaining what happened historically when he was charged with his trial, for example, of Jesus of Nazarene. They were in Galilee. That fulfilled the prophecy. Where he happened to settle was Nazareth. And because of that, he later was called Nazarios. The Nazarios may not have anything to do with prophecy, other than it may just be the historical note that that's where he settled.
Yes, sir.
For subsequent revisions, you may just want to tighten up the first pages where you're giving us the exegesis of Matthew 2.
Yep.
Part of it reads like a running commentary on the verses, but doesn't funnel to your thesis,
Yep.
so you could probably eliminate some of that.
That did happen. I had a 35-page exegetical paper that this came from very quickly. So this was written 2 weeks ago, and I asked if I could still get it in. So
I understand.
Yeah.
What I did was a 40-page paper that was condensed to 20 and I 22, and it was.
yeah, I haven't even got a chance to pay somebody good money to edit this yet. If any of you edit, mine just got picked up from Puritan Reform, so I'm out of debt. He's now gainfully employed. So please find it. Yes, sir.
And did this position originate with you? Did you find anyone that argued for it or got
No,
close to it?
In fact, my dissertation chair said, "What makes you smarter than everybody else?" So I said, "I'm probably the only guy working in Matthew that's working on a testing PhD." He didn't like that answer. So, yes, sir.
You clearly are using a lot of ideas from Stephen Blanket here. with
Absolutely.
linguistics.
And Porter.
Did you pick up some ideas from this directly from Runge, or did you see this after you had pretty well mastered a lot of Runge's technique?
Yeah, I mastered a lot of language. So, when I started at Baptist Bible Seminary, one of the things that they stress is verbal aspect of discourse analysis. So at Liberty, I do my New Testament work. BBS makes you take one class outside of your discipline. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll take an independent study of verbal aspect and one in discourse analysis. And then anytime I knew I wanted to do the Gegner type passages, which are all redundant quotative frames. So this is actually, this Pleroo passage, I think there's a matching forward-pointing Gegner type passage in Matthew 26, which is another paper I'm writing. And so, like, this one is the weaker argument. I think the stronger one is Matthew 26. Where does it say that, oh man, the Son of Man goes away as it is written? Where does it say that? The next passage in Zechariah where it says strike the shepherd. When you see that is a euphemism for death. So I think that when you have those two strategically placed at the front end of Jesus' public ministry and the back end of Jesus' public ministry, I think that's important. And what's highlighted in between that two narratives is the Lord's Supper, the new covenant, the institution of the new covenant. So I think that those two things are emphatic. And I think that's actually the stronger argument, but it's a totality of weight type of deal that I'm working on. Because that's my goal. I'm writing my dissertation at Liberty on the use of gate time at the hospital. So, as I work through those, it's easier for me to see redundant rotative frames. And everybody works on Pleroo all the time. I didn't want to write on Pleroo until I found something, because it mostly just ends up with everybody quoting R2 France. Anybody else? Thank you for not trashing me. I appreciate that. Well, call me back now.